Please welcome Bret Perkins, Comcast Corporation Senior Vice President of External and Government Affairs, and Bruce Katz, Nowak Metro Finance Lab Director.
Earlier this year, I had the great opportunity to serve with a diverse group of 160 regional leaders on the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Philadelphia's Regional Recharge and Recovery Task Force. It was an important public-private partnership effort to prepare our region for durable recovery while resetting our expectations for what needs to be done to address the systemic inequities making progress difficult for far too many of our citizens. To learn more about what is possible and what we should strive for, we are in for a treat. With me is one of the nation's leading urban thinkers who will share his thoughts and experiences helping to build dynamic metro economies nationally and globally. I will do a very brief introduction that will not do justice to his work and accomplishments, but will allow us more time for discussion. Bruce Katz is the co-founder and inaugural director of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab and fellow at Drexel's Lindsay Institute for Urban Innovation. Bruce is the co-author of a few books, including The New Localism, How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism, a book I have on my bookshelf. Bruce was the inaugural Centennial Scholar at the Brookings Institution. Before joining Brookings, Bruce served as Chief of Staff to HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros. There is a lot to cover, so let's dig in. In September, you wrote something for the Philadelphia Citizen, an article called Building Philadelphia Back Better, and you called for doubling down on innovation. So tell me, what does that look like?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, Bret. What Richard Florida and I were trying to tease out was, what could a bottom-up, authentic recovery playbook look like for Philadelphia, given your distinctive assets, given your distinctive advantages, and the challenges that you had pre-COVID, which have been, exacerbated by these crises. And so, our first area of focus was on innovation. The Philadelphia economy is globally significant because you've got these advanced research institutions, companies, startups, scale-ups. You've got an incredible platform that's really known all around the world, particularly around precision medicine and some of the deep chops, so to speak, you have around healthcare. And so, we feel that the recovery, will obviously depend upon federal investments. We hope that those will be coming at a very large scale. But at the end of the day, you can only harness and deploy them if they align with what you're good at. So if the federal government was going to provide dramatic increases in investments around research and development, centers of excellence, Philadelphia is already good at and could be better at commercializing that research and really be, realizing your full potential from a job creation, company formation, inclusive effect of what is a very significant innovation-oriented economy. And so that was our main initial focus. As we move to the recovery phase, jobs and economic growth is going to come off these very distinctive bases in individual cities and metros. You're one of the most distinctive.
Right. One of the key considerations of the Chamber's plan was to focus on inclusive growth, given that COVID has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities. What should local stakeholders be doing right now to help minority businesses prepare for the recovery?
Well, I think this is really a central question, the central question, because what we're about to experience, in contrast to the Great Recession, which was a housing-led crack up, this is going to be a small business-led recession, particularly Main Street business-led recession. And the fact of the matter is that Black-owned business, Latino-owned business, were affected disproportionately by this because they tend to be in those sectors that got hit very hard. And they don't tend to have the banking relationships that would have given them the ability to access, for example, the federal Paycheck Protection Program to the same level that other firms did. So we've got a big challenge on our hands because pre-COVID, frankly, Black and Latino-owned business were not at the size or the scale that they need to be to create wealth in communities. And so pre-COVID, we were talking about doubling the number of Black-owned businesses and expanding the number of Latino-owned businesses. Well, guess what? We've got an even bigger hill to climb now because many of these firms have shuttered because of COVID. I think what has to happen as we move forward here is that the federal government needs a broader set of products, a broader set of distribution channels, so that we can begin to stabilize businesses that are still surviving, help them grow back, and then restart at scale new businesses. And it won't just be capital that's needed. It's a whole different philosophy about customers, anchor procurement, supplier diversity, services, commercial corridors, main streets. We need a whole ecosystem effect to grow Black and brown-owned business, because that's the only way we're going to come out of this recession better.
You've got experience across the country working with cities and metro economies. Are there cities that we should be looking to for examples that are really leading the way here?
Well, it's a great question. The great thing about cities, and particularly since we're in a conference called Ideas We Can Steal, all cities do is steal from each other. I mean, they just, absolutely plagiarize. So I think as Philly's moving forward, first of all, Philly is distinctive because you've got a very deep bench of practitioners. Jeremy Nowak, who co-authored the new Localism with me, was one of those practitioners, a reflective practitioner who knew how to get stuff done, but also knew about how to think about the next round of products. Cincinnati is probably the best place for Philly to look at because for the last 40 or 50 years, what Procter & Gamble and what Kroger's did, was it provided that platform of procurement, purchasing of goods and services from large companies that fueled the growth of Black-owned businesses. And then the regional chamber set up a minority business accelerator so that they could focus on not just the number of Black-owned businesses, but their size and their sector. So what we see in Cincinnati is a place that is performing quite well in terms of large numbers of large Black-owned businesses, but that's because they've been working at it for decades. And I think that kind of ecosystem approach, not just looking for the perfect magic capital product, but an ecosystem approach across multiple sectors, I think is what's going to be critical.
Right. It's been said that we're in a triple crisis: COVID, a racial reckoning, and an economic recession. And we can add a fourth to that list, which is the coming ramifications from automation and artificial intelligence. What role do you think this will have in a city like Philadelphia? And are there steps that we should be taking now to address these coming changes?
Well, I would also add climate to the list. I mean, this is just sort of a confluence of events all hitting at the same time, all hitting every city and metropolis. I think the most important thing is to think about a 21st century kind of governance where the public sector is collaborating to compete and recover with the private, civic, university sectors, labor, and others, with no distance between them. The national government is critical in a crisis like this because it's the only one who can open up its wallet, frankly. I mean, that's its role. But it will send resources down in verticals. Here's something around small business. Here's something around infrastructure or innovation or human capital in the best situation. Those resources need to be braided and blended locally, horizontally, not vertically, and really put behind a playbook that is authentic and aligned to your priorities and your distinctive advantages. So I think coming out of this crisis, we need cities and metropolitan areas to declare their vision that is really rooted in who they are, and then begin to reverse engineer national policy and private sector policy and practice, and really lead the country forward. You know, later today, I'm going to be in a call with Toronto. They have the playbook for Greater Toronto, and they're now meeting with different ministries from the Canadian national government so that those ministries can align their investments to what Toronto has declared to be their priorities. We need a bottom-up recovery, even though a lot of the focus will be on, as it should be, the federal government and what kind of resources it has.
So you call for at least a $250 million Philadelphia regeneration fund to ensure that capable intermediaries can build more capacity, proven successes can be scaled, and innovative solutions can be tested. So where do you see this capital investment coming from, and who ought to be accountable for this?
Well, here's the starting point for Philadelphia. You are an incredibly wealthy metropolis, but you don't have a supersized philanthropy like the Lilly Endowment in Indianapolis, or the combination of the Heinz Endowment, Hillman Foundation, and Mellon Foundation in Pittsburgh. And so you don't really have a source of philanthropic and patient capital that can be put towards economy shaping. You have it on the social service side with United Way. You don't have it on the economy shaping side. And $250 million, frankly, was a conservative number. Because if you look at what's working in other cities on a regular, routinized basis, their philanthropic sector are making big bets around centers of excellence, around new kinds of capital funds, new kinds of products, either around innovation in its narrow sense, tech-enabled, deep tech, or around the growth of Black and Brown-owned businesses, around redevelopment. Look to Cincinnati again and what has happened with the Center City Development Corporation, which has, over the past 15 years, regenerated the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood, a near downtown neighborhood. So these other competitive cities are putting in very substantial resources into new kinds of intermediaries that have capacity, capital, and community standing. And then you can leverage up private and public sector investment and have the full inclusive effect. So what we're basically saying to Philadelphia, you've got to compensate for the fact that as a major globally significant metropolis, you don't have a supersized philanthropy that is dedicated to economy shaping towards inclusive outcomes. And therefore, across multiple sectors, we're going to need to pull and harness new kinds of capital, an inclusive growth fund, a regeneration fund, so that you can begin to realize the full impact of your assets. So it's not easy, but it's absolutely essential. The federal government and its resources won't be as aligned or as patient as what local resources can be.
That's interesting, Bruce. And I think it's an interesting mix of ways that we need to think about this. On the one hand, we have this unique, and in some cases, globally unique set of assets. On the other hand, we have some real gaps that we just need to appreciate and solve for to be able to exploit those unique assets. So that's helpful. Thank you. So you've dug into the way that Philadelphia works, and this may relate a little bit back to this previous question, or how it might not work. And you said that we've got the bones for positive transformation. Have you observed, or what have you observed in our culture, whether it be silos or something else that maybe gets in our way? And have there been cities that you've worked with that have overcome these that you would point to?
Well, when we wrote the new Localism, what Jeremy and I were focusing on were cities like Indianapolis or Pittsburgh or Copenhagen that had experienced major economic shocks, and were able, after that, to come together with new kinds of governance and finance models. In Indianapolis, it was the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, which is a mix of the major corporations, universities, and philanthropies that have bet over 25 years on substantial growth around what they're good at, which is biosciences, particularly medical devices. In Pittsburgh, it was this multi-decade investments around robotics, artificial intelligence, genomics, next generation technologies. And in Copenhagen, it was a new kind of model of taking publicly owned land, regenerating through mixed use along harbor fronts, and then using a portion of the value creation to actually service the debt on a major transit system. So public wealth, public benefit coming from the regeneration of a harbor front. Everyone's in a crisis right now, essentially. Everyone is experiencing this almost existential economic shock. What's the future of central business districts? What's the future of innovation hubs? And how do we grow back Black and brown-owned businesses better to create wealth for both the owners and for workers? So the bottom line is there needs to be a coherence of leadership and an unusual kind of radical collaboration across sectors. What Philly's very good at is each individual institution, which are globally significant, University of Pennsylvania, Drexel, et cetera, globally significant institutions maximizing their own potential. We need now to knit that together and find a new way for the wealth of the metropolis to invest in itself. From my perspective, in many U.S. metros, a lot of the wealth is invested out of the metro. People are finding investments all around the world, right? It's time to look back inside and say, how do we provide both philanthropic, patient, and market investing so that Philly becomes the best 21st century version of itself? That's probably going to be new kinds of intermediaries and institutions which may not even exist yet. In St. Louis, 5 different economic organizations are merging into one, backed, like in Indianapolis, with large amounts of private capital so that they can prepare for the recovery. So this may be a moment of disruption in governance and finance across multiple sectors. I think that's the only way we're going to build back better.
So let me dig in on one thread around that. You've often talked about how cities don't have a capital problem, they have an access to capital problem. Can you elaborate a little bit on how cities like Philadelphia leave money on the table by not leveraging their assets, and maybe give us some examples? I know you've talked a lot about in Northern Europe how they are able to better leverage their assets.
Yes, cities are. We tend to think of cities in the United States as governments, and cities are not governments, they're networks. The federal government is a government, states are governments, and that's frankly why they can be hijacked by partisanship, and they are on a weekly basis. Cities are networks, so they tend to be hyper pragmatic. And the key to cities is how do you organize those networks across these multiple sectors? How do you get universities and hospitals and corporations and labor unions and public sector government, philanthropies to actually work together towards a common aim? So capital is not really the problem because these institutions are unbelievably wealthy, and including many households in the metropolis, as one of our original great American cities and metros. The question is, how do you invest with a purpose? And that's what these other mid-tier metros in the United States have been able to do. They've been able to say, we need to do X, either regenerate a near downtown community like over the Rhine in Cincinnati, grow Black-owned business, leverage our innovation assets as in Pittsburgh or elsewhere, and then put patient and philanthropic capital behind that at substantial levels. What that then enables a city to do is then deploy federal and other private investment at scale. It's a 2 + 2 = 5 effect. And I think Philadelphia, because your individual assets are so dramatic, you still experience some not completely shared, but prosperity. You've experienced it up to a point. But if we could begin to pull and harness capital together and resources, both dollar and human resources in a more constructive way, I think we could set off a different kind of growth that would bring more people along for the ride. So I think the major threshold paradigmatic shift here is not to think about cities as governments. They're not. They're a different kind of organism. They're networks, they're ecosystems. They're more aligned to the way the world actually works than this hierarchical, vertically driven, mid-20th century, government model. But it doesn't happen. You have to be intentional and purposeful about it to fully unlock that potential.
So you talk to literally people globally who work in this space. You've had the chance to work with people in federal government, state government, local government. Are there a couple of people that you point to who say really get this, who are leading on pulling together how cities as ecosystems work? Who's in your top list of people that you'd pick up the phone?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, I would say in the United States, what's so interesting about the United States compared to Europe, because I think in Europe and other parts of the world, it's very public sector driven. So if I want to, have the next generation conversation with Copenhagen, I'll call Jens Kramer Mikkelsen, who had been the mayor of Copenhagen when they set up Copenhagen City and Port, which is this public asset corporation, which has brought back the harbor front and built a 21st century transit system. In the United States, you tend to talk to private and civic and university leaders. So if you go to Indianapolis, which is just a tremendous success story, you talk to David Johnson, who runs the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. I'm not sure, the public, many people in the public know who David is, but he's the person really connecting the dots between all the different sectors, the big corporations, the universities, the philanthropies, the government, city, state. And when he pulls together a meeting of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, they meet to decide, not to discuss. They're making investments in biosciences, in workforce development, in innovation districts near the downtown. It's governance across multiple sectors with capital and a purpose. So, Richard Shatton did that in Cleveland with Cleveland Tomorrow. I mean, these are the people really collaborating and pushing collaboration to compete and problem solve. They're not elected, but they work so closely hand in glove with elected officials. I think that's what's fueling American cities and metros today.
So We could spend another hour or two or three on this conversation. I think everyone who is watching will readily recognize that you've already given us probably a half a dozen ideas that we should steal. And the good thing for us is that you're a Philadelphia lover. We know that we'll get frequent visits into Philadelphia, and so we appreciate you spending time with us today and for having this conversation. And we look forward to stealing more ideas from you into the future. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Brett. It's wonderful to be with you, and it's wonderful to be affiliated with Drexel, which is just a remarkable global institution.
A special thank you to our sponsors.